Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's panel discussion entitled The New Normal, The Path to City Recovery Post-COVID-19. My name is Marka Armstrong, and I lead the marketing function at Passport, who is the host of today's discussion. At Passport, we are the operating system that helps all of you as city leaders manage your vehicle interactions with your streets and your sidewalks in an effort to help you all create more livable and equitable communities. It's for that reason that we're very passionate about today's conversation. I'm joined by a group of esteemed moderators and panelists who have extensive leadership in city government, and I'm confident that they will provide you with some great insights this afternoon. So before we get started, just a couple of tactical reminders. This webinar is being recorded. If you have a question, please put your question in the Q&A feature at the bottom, and we'll do our best to address it at the end during our Q&A session. If there is a question that comes up that makes sense to address midstream, we'll do our best to get to it. So on to our introductions. I am joined by Stephen Goldsmith, Professor of Government at the Harvard Kennedy School of Public Policy. Welcome, Stephen. Stephen will serve as our lead moderator today. In addition, we have Gabe Klein, who is a partner and co-founder of CityFi, a platform for urban change management. Welcome, Gabe. Our third moderator, Michael Schnuerle, serves as the first ever Chief Data Officer in the Office of Civic Innovation and Technology in the city of Louisville, Kentucky. Welcome, Michael. In addition to our moderators, we're joined by three leaders in city government. John Hamblin, the parking manager of the City of Pasadena Department of Transportation. Joe Barr, Director of Parking, Traffic and Transportation for the City of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Joseph Alhajri, Mobility Services Supervisor for the City of Austin Transportation Department in Texas. Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate your time this afternoon. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Stephen to start our discussion.
Thanks, Marco. So I'm just going to make a few comments and then maybe call on other folks. And then, since I know most everybody who's speaking today, give me more liberty to interrupt them during their presentations to ask them provocative questions if I can. And I would just start with in the following sense, right? So this is, I've been a local government official for 30 years now. I teach local officials. And obviously, this is the most disruptive, difficult moment in the last century, right? I mean, it's just hugely disruptive and challenging. And I just was on a call with chiefs of staff of 25 cities. You know, 2/3 of Americans have either lost their jobs or lost hours or lost income already, deeply anxious about their future, even with the recovery dollars. I mean, you know, I was a mayor in India, as Marcus said, and deputy mayor in New York, and even when things start easing back, the deep losses to sales taxes, income taxes, property taxes are almost just unimaginable. So that's one set of conditions, right? And then we have the other set of conditions that mobility was already beginning to change, right? The modes of mobility, how we manage the curb, how residents communicate with the curb or with the city, how the city uses data. So we have this kind of compounding dynamic that is particularly challenging. So I appreciate the title of the event. And then, you know, so in addition to those things, then we've got this idea of, well, we have a number of really enlightened parking and mobility managers on the conference today. How are we thinking about generating more revenues for our cities? How we think about enhancing customer experience? How we think about the special things that, you know, places that might have been restaurants yesterday may be closed tomorrow, or maybe they're half restaurants and half delivery and takeout kitchens. So how does that affect mobility in the curb and the like? So with that, Gabe, you've been a transportation director in 2 large cities, and now you advise any number of others. And would you explain the future to us?
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, sure. Well, look, I think, first of all, thanks for having me today. It's great to be here. big fan of your work and passports as well. And I think when we ask ourselves this question about where are things going, we have to address the variables out there. I was talking to my sister last night who was stressed about, is the government going to open, and is it going to open too quickly? And one of the problems that we face right now is you've got, some studies saying that we aren't going to see a death after June 21st. And then you have others saying we're going to be holed up in our homes, the Harvard study through 2022. And so I think when you have this many variables, it makes people anxious. It makes people anxious because they really can't predict what's going to happen. But I think what should give people hope is the ingenuity of Americans, looking for solutions to problems is pretty much unparalleled. And so I have faith that we will get through this as a country, as a people, and it'll probably make us stronger. When you look at mobility, though, sort of writ large, I mean, it's easy to ask questions. You and I have talked about, what's going to happen to transit, and shared mobility. Are people still going to use it in the same way after this? And I think what's interesting, we do a lot of like urban change management work, and we've been watching business models that have been having problems for a while, whether it be WeWork or Lime or public transit systems in some cities that were, hugely underfunded. And so the headways were hourly, for instance, instead of every 15 minutes. So I think where there were already fissures before, there's this force function that's sort of pushing it faster and faster towards the inevitable, if you will. And so we are going to see some businesses in our space shut down. We'll see others grow stronger. But I think nobody is immune to it. I think, whether it's Uber or WeWork or whoever, there are going to be repercussions for problems with business models. But I think we shouldn't be too distracted by asking ourselves, will it survive? Will this be here? If it was serving a core function for society, if it's very important to government operations, if people relied on it before to get to work, unless we see a massive shift or this lasts, years versus months, I tend to think that many of the services that we've come to know and rely on will be necessary, particularly if they're affordable. I think one thing that you touched on, I think we'll see after this lets up, is unfortunately a long tail of economic impact and disarray. And so I think, particularly from a consumer standpoint, but also from a government standpoint, the idea of things being affordable and necessary will be absolutely key. And to your other point, for those of us who are working in government or have worked in government, whenever these things happen and the budget office calls you, they usually say, okay, give me cuts or give me revenues, right? And they tend to believe the cuts more. But I think it'll be really, really important to look at revenue opportunities, particularly around parking, because that's something that the finance folks believe in. But also there are other opportunities. We don't want to see scooters go away. We don't want to see bikes go away. So how do we work together with these companies to share in the upside and downside and keep them as feasible options for the future?
So as we move to Michael, Gabe, one question. What do you see as a way that parking departments could most directly increase revenues coming out of the, as we ease back out into some period of normalcy? What one or two ideas would you suggest? You have some of the best mobility managers in the country on this conference call, so give them one great idea that they can attribute to you.
Well, I mean, I'll say one thing. I'll say that, my old boss, Rahm Emanuel, said, make lemonade out of lemons. Don't let a good crisis go to waste. All kinds of very quotable things. But I do think that there's things that we've been wanting or needing to do that may be more plausible politically now. And as one example, this is sort of something I've been thinking about for the last couple of days, the automation of the enforcement function. which is traditionally something that we have steered away from for parking because it feels like big brother. But I think that that's something that we might need to look at. I think, you know, from what I've seen, you can see tripling of revenues. So, you know, I think using technology to sort of close the loop faster and also to change behavior so people don't break the law in the first place could be very useful.
Thanks. Michael, you're in an interesting place. You're not like, you have a job different than most of the rest of us here because you're in the data office. You are the data office in Louisville. You've got a mayor who's got a reputation of being particularly data-driven and progressive. How do you think about the overlap between the data that's available from a mobility platform and the conditions we're going to face coming out of the virus?
Yeah, thanks for having me today too, just like Gabe said. And thanks to you, Stephen. So something Stephen does is he convenes us chief data officers and the like through the Harvard Kennedy School. And that network of people, we've been working on issues like this kind of at a holistic citywide level for a while. And some of that trickles down into transportation and parking. But, you know, I think Gabe touched on something, which is that automation of enforcement. I think that's going to be huge. It's something we've been wanting to do more of. All of us have, where we want to know what's going on in our right of way and our parking spaces, on our streets, on our sidewalks. And if we can get that information about what is happening there and a way to, like Gabe said, close that feedback loop, to enforce it remotely or change dynamically what's happening, what pricing is, what's available, where curb drop-offs are, where freight or delivery drop-offs are, where pickups are for Ubers and Lyfts, and change all of that, I think it would be really, it's where we're going to have to go. And there's a lot of reasons for that. In Louisville, you know, we, like many cities, we manage our scooter fleets, and with our scooter fleets, we have just one person whose part-time job is to manage all of that. And they're only able to do that because we have access to the back and forth real-time data. We can send data to the companies about where vehicles should be, where they need to park, what the speeds are. We do all that dynamically, digitally, and then they can send us information about their fleets and their usage and ridership, and we can enforce our policies that way. So I think that's been a really good model for how to do things digitally. I think that sort of same model will start to be applied to things like Ubers and Lyfts, parking, freight, you know, UPS, FedEx, delivery, et cetera. And I think that's really where we're going to go. And, you know, if you think about it from a COVID perspective, that also reduces the need to have people walking around, touching meters and other devices, interacting with people, writing tickets and stuff like that. You can get those people out of the way of that virus in such a manner. It's not only more efficient, but it's safer for the health of those people. And then I want to throw out some predictions. So I want to throw out some predictions, which maybe we can talk about on the call. Yeah. And these are probably going to be wrong, but I want the experts, the transportation people, to talk about some of these things, because I think you guys know more than me. But if I think about the effect of this, I think one big effect is people will realize that remote work is possible and it's more efficient, and it's going to save companies a lot of money, and cities. So cities, we're doing a lot of remote work now too. But I think that will reduce the amount of commuter traffic. So there'll be less cars on the road, but that would increase the amount of sprawl. So I think we'll see more people not being attracted to the center of cities because they don't have to be there as much anymore. That will increase the number of cars that are owned because people will need cars more, even though there's less driving to concentrated locations happening. But the opportunity here, I think, is that because of that reduced congestion, there might be more of an appetite to provide more dedicated bus lanes and or bike lanes, which were not there. That appetite wasn't there because there was this constant fear of car congestion. And I think that bus ridership will probably go down because it's more of a communal experience. But I do think that shared mobility and owned mobility, micromobility, will increase. And I think some of that may be subsidized by cities in the way that we subsidize buses sometimes. So anyway, there's some of my predictions, and you all can shoot that down.
Michael, I got a couple of questions for you, and I'm going to go to Joe and give him a question he doesn't expect. But Mark, would you put up, Michael referred to touching. Would you put up that, graphic for just a second? So, in this current public health environment, mayors and governors have rightfully taken a fair amount of authority, right? I mean, they've used it to protect the public. And, the most extraordinary use of authority is just to tell people to stay home and can't go to work, right? I mean, there's very few things that are quite that comprehensive. That means that things that are less comprehensive that might not have been imaginable before are the case. So if you this is just a graphic I found, but there's no real reason that I can figure out why we have parking meters at all other than to spread contamination, right? We have stored value cards that we could use for the unbanked. And so Michael mentioned enforcement, why there's no reason why the enforcement officer has to touch the windshield. There's no reason why you have to actually hold the driver's license from somebody there, right? That it could all be digital. And similarly, you could pay all digitally. This is just a graphic that shows that this is touching parking meters is a good way to statistically catch, get sick in one way or another, maybe COVID. So I just thought that, that the graphic was interesting. So thanks, Marka. So Joe, we're over to you. So look, I paid you a lot of money because I work in your city, so I feel like, you must owe me something. I can't quite figure out what that is. So why do you have this antiquated process where you put in parking meters and you pay people to maintain them and you allow people to touch them? How about just moving to the future like Michael predicted?
Well, I think it's a good question. I guess I'll start by saying that, and we also appreciate your contributions to our parking fund. But I guess the main reason I would say is that, and you sort of mentioned it earlier, is the sort of equity issues around the unbanked, as well as just generally, government inertia, which I think we're all probably familiar with in one way or another. And so I think that, we're moving, we're working obviously with Passport and also trying to sort of open that system up for mobile payments. And we've gotten our mobile payments up to, I think the last numbers I was looking at was close to 60% of our parking transactions were via mobile, which is great. And we're also, looking to transition to new meters that can, take payment contactless or, just with a simple credit card. I think, but the idea, certainly in a community like Cambridge, the idea of getting rid of the option of some sort of cash payment or some sort of coin payment is hard to fathom for people. And even more so in a way at this moment where I think, people are increasingly becoming concerned about the equity impacts of COVID and the current situation. I think the sense we have is that, it would be a tough time to start talking about removing that option. We certainly are trying to discourage it for a whole variety of reasons. And, I think the exposure, one of the things we're thinking about as we consider when we go back to work, is we're not enforcing or requiring meter payments right now, is, what does that mean for our employees who actually collect the coins? Because they actually are probably more so than anyone else exposing themselves to, contact with every single meter on a weekly basis. And so what do we have to do for them? And if we could, the more we minimize that, the more we avoid that, I think the better off that we are. I guess the other thing I just wanted to say in terms of enforcement, although I don't disagree that automation of enforcement is coming and this may hasten it, I think it's also important to think about the staff that, do that work. And if we start to think about, them not being there, the sort of impacts of that on those people, is challenging. Obviously, there's probably other things we can find that they might be able to do. So it's not that we have to, just let them go. But I think we need to be very sensitive to sort of the perception of what that might look like in the short term. For employees who've we've been lucky enough not to have to furlough folks, but that's obviously not necessarily the norm.
Any other observations, Joseph, about Michael's predictions or the like? What you in Boston have tinkered a little bit with dynamic pricing, and one of the things Michael said, I agree generally with most of what Michael said. I can't figure out whether, because of people don't want to share a vehicle, whether maybe single occupancy vehicles may have a little bit of a resurgence over TNCs in the short run. So what do you think about dynamic pricing in front of your local restaurant that's doing pickups, where you might want to have a 15-minute setting at high times? Any thought about using the data for pricing purposes?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really interesting thing to start thinking about or continue thinking about. And I do think that, we sort of had this unexpected experience of having our curbs cleared. We always talk about sort of how difficult it is to change parking regulations, but all of a sudden, I just drove around Cambridge for a couple hours yesterday, and there was no one parked at the meters, which is not unexpected, but it sort of does provide us with an opportunity to sort of think, well, okay, we thought that these were sort of immovable objects, as it were, and now we've proven that they're not. Obviously, there's economic consequences of that, but I think the idea of sort of more dynamically using our curb, which we all talk about but don't necessarily know how to implement, that maybe this creates that opportunity to think that through. Obviously, that would have to happen pretty quickly, or else we may be just back to our previous operating scenarios. And certainly I expect, and I think a lot of people here expect, that local businesses will push really hard against any other changes unless they're supportive of those businesses, because they're all struggling. We're trying to help them out, and when life goes back to quote unquote normal, whatever that actually looks like, I think they're going to be pushing for us to do everything we can to support them, even if that's not completely consistent with what our policies had been prior to all this happening.
You might support them, as a question, you might support them by increasing the turnover rate of a spot, right?
Yep.
People
well,
think, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think, and I think, we've managed to convince most of our businesses, and certainly our business associations, of the value of, dynamic pricing and, price changes. And we were actually in the process of discussing a rate increase in some of our higher utilization areas like Harvard Square, that you're obviously very familiar with, right, literally up to the weeks leading up to this sort of really becoming a serious issue that caused us to shut down. Where those discussions go after the immediate crisis is past, I don't know, but I think we'll have to continue to make that case, because if we start to sort of regress too much, whether it's on parking policy or on promoting public transit, or the things that we've been successful in doing over the last over the last couple of decades, I think we really do run the danger, kind of to Michael's predictions, that cities wind up becoming less livable places and places that are harder to make successful. And I would really hate to lose the progress that we've made in that respect. But yeah, I don't disagree that the idea of getting on a bus or on a crowded subway train is going to feel kind of weird for some period of time. And whether that period of time is 6 months or 18 months or, several years, it's kind of hard to say what that's going to look like. And I don't know that, we can all make predictions. I don't know that obviously any of us would think that we actually know what's going to happen.
All right, so Gabe, if real fast before we go to Joseph and John, if the, I don't know what the right word is, if the yield per spot goes up as app usage goes up, and if pricing can create more turnover and better service, you've been on the vanguard of those issues. How do you see that playing out real quickly?
Yeah, well, no, it's an interesting question. I was just thinking about this and some of the work that we've done on pricing, and also what Joe was saying, that we have to be very careful in these tough times. Like we don't want to change policy and make it seem like we're taking advantage of people, right? Which is the last thing that we want to do. And even though enforcement in some ways creates more turnover, and if it's automated, in terms of pricing, you know, just moving to by the minute pricing can have a big impact in turnover. Here in DC, we worked on a pilot where we had some private property where we were able to put pay by phone pricing in, and we started doing by the minute. And we did the same thing with the developers off-street parking. So by balancing the pricing and charging by the minute, people were sensitive to the fact that they were paying through the app only, that they wanted to make that trip as short as possible. And also there's more revenue generated because as soon as that person leaves, the next person's coming in using the app and paying. So I think there are ways to increase revenue that might be viewed as positive by the parking public, for instance, while also generating more revenues instead of it feeling like the government's trying to get me.
Very good. Joseph, Austin, everything's perfect in Austin until it wasn't.
Yeah, that's right. And thank you all again for having me on, and everybody here for contributions. Yeah, to everybody's point, I think that, you know, the new norm or whatever that's going to look like, we are definitely here trying to prepare for that. And what does, you know, dynamic pricing or parking or things like that going to, you know, really change our curve? I kind of agree with you, Stephen, that, you know, at some point, the short term, there's going to be an increase in SOV usage. People are just not comfortable yet to jump on a bus or a train and feel more comfortable in their own personal space. So how do we handle that? And here in Austin, we've really tackled that and said, well, we need to continue with what our progress was and not relax on that. And we're already heading to doing some progressive pricing on our curve. So instead of doing something that dynamically, where our focus is saying that, you know, the longer that you stay in your space, there's a larger mobility impact to the entire system. And so we wanted to keep with that, and we've been focused on making sure that we message that out, that we're gonna continue with that, and that, you know, in the future, our curb space may look different, but our challenge here is to make sure that it's as equitable as possible, not only just to the person that owns a vehicle, but to the others that don't, as well as, you know, the different types of users for that curb space. And so it's been a challenge, but we're pressing forward.
Hey, Joseph, I don't know whether you were part of it or not, and Mark may know. So Charlotte and a few other cities did a pilot with using the Passport platform for purposes of increasing the revenues that came from micro-mobility, right? So you could price the scooters based on where they came from and where they were, and the city would then derive, obviously, income from that. This has been obviously a really bad time for scooters, but I remember when I was at South by Southwest last year, looking out the hotel window at more scooters per square inch than I'd seen in my entire life, right? So how do you think about the return of the scooters and whether you could use a platform to drive more revenues and better equity distribution of the scooters as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we really have a chance to really fortify shared mobility at this point, especially micro mobility and scooters, right? I think, and also from the very beginning, and what we've done during this, you know, public health crisis, is that we want to make sure the public understood that we believe that shared mobility, micro mobility, is an essential transportation service, right? You know, we work with them to increase how they handle their devices and how they place them on the streets, how they disinfect them. But we wanted to make sure that it was continued to be viewed as an essential service for those that need it, as people felt like they couldn't get into other transportation services due to concerns of COVID-19. You know, I think, you know, really looking in the long term, what we really have to be aware of is that shared mobility and how we, I guess, relaunched it after COVID-19 is taking our previous data although it's kind of mixed match and there hasn't been consistency yet because the market was still growing, is being able to use that to be able to provide benchmarks when it comes back to, so that we can collect the data that we want, and to make better choices for those that need it. Working with the companies more closely, more intimately to, provide services throughout the city for, areas that are transit deserts, and being able to use that to push, more usage in that areas, as well as what our current, rules say about within our cities. So we're taking this time to kind of really take on the challenge to say what, there's no such thing as technically as a post-COVID. We're going to be, living with this for the rest of our lives. There's a new normal for that. So how do we provide, a comfort for people that want to use them in the future, and how we can continue to ensure that it is an essential transportation service moving forward.
Yeah, that's helpful. I know there's a question, but I want to get to John first. So John, I wanted to get to you last for a couple of reasons. One, I'm from Indiana. The Big Ten always loses in the Rose Bowl. So I just wanted to see if I could pay you back by making sure that we ignored you till the very end. So it wasn't accidental, it was very intentional. So
duly noted.
Would you just, I don't know what you were going to plan to talk about. Let me prompt you for a second. So Joseph and Joseph both mentioned, actually Gabe too, actually all the prior folks, thinking about a mobility platform, right? So not just a parking app, not just a micromobility app, but how do we think about this platform, call it an API layer platform that Mark had mentioned that Passport has. But so how would you think about using data broadly? Pasadena is a pretty popular place to manage the curb. Is that a revenue opportunity? Is that too far out there? How are you thinking about that?
It's a little far out there, but I think it's certainly a tool we're going to want to look at. I think part of the challenge we have right now, and I think all of us in our downtown specifically, is what is the business? We're here to support businesses. I tell my business community that all the time. We're here to support you guys. And the question is, what is it going to look like? How many of my restaurateurs, which is a huge part of Old Pasadena, how many of them are going to survive this? What's that landscape going to look like? What I found in the preliminary conversations, and I've talked to more business owners this last 2 weeks than I have talked to in probably 2 years combined previous. They're scared, but it's been a big back to basics push for me. It's been really a lot of coaching them again on, hey, here's why we do the parking management, the mobility management that we do. We're trying to bring wallets to your district. We're trying to bring people in, and understanding now what that looks like is 20-minute time limits in front of all restaurants, to try and encourage the pickup and drop off turnover. So, and it's way back to basics. So the neighbors for the restaurant next door, their dishwasher isn't parking right in front of your business. It's that basic, and doing that kind of coaching with all of them to help them understand that, we're here to help. Now, coming out of this, I think we have to acknowledge it's going to be a gradual process. There's not a light switch we're going to flip. Everybody's not coming back all at once. I think we're going to have the opportunity to show people that, I'm already getting asked for, hey, when are you going to put free parking signs up? When are you going to lift the gates in the garages and give everybody free parking? And I think this is an opportunity for us to show them that here's some parking management tools we're going to use. Here's the strategies and why we're doing what we're doing, and get the buy-in. Again, we're going to have to, I know I am going to have to go back and get that buy-in from the business owners to do what we need to do and use all the tools that we want to use. So I think it's really, we have to take a couple of steps back before we can start walking forward again. They're scared, they're hurting, and they want any help they can get. And they look to us as municipalities to say, hey, you have control of the levers. You can pull those levers and make life easier. And hey, free parking, who doesn't love that? Well, and then it's, here's why we don't love that. Here's why we want to do what we're going to do, and try and get their buy-in. So it's a big, big step back to basics to me.
Is there anywhere where the retail establishment you call as your customers uses the app to pay for parking for their patrons? Is that possible, or does anybody do that?
It's possible. It is possible. We're not currently doing that, but it is something, in a COVID-less world, we were headed in that direction for sure. It's basically a validation system. And absolutely, we wanted to open that up, and we still will in the future. But we just don't know what the timing of that's going to be.
Let me ask any of the panelists. Mark, I'm going to use the question that, and maybe I might put this back to one of the passport people too. So the question basically says, is an equity question. It says if we're going to go asset free, then we have to resolve the equity question. So maybe I'll start with Gabe, but then maybe ask one of the passport folks or one of the other panelists. I don't understand why that's so difficult. I don't understand why a city, right? There were cities experimenting with subsidized vouchers for pool rides on TNC for folks who are underserved to get to work, right? So South Bend did one where they subsidized folks with TNC pool rides where the bus system was, was insufficient. So if you could provide funds, and think EBT cards, stored value cards, I think it's really important that equity be addressed, like Joe Barr mentioned. But Gabe, why is that so difficult? And Marka, is there somebody on the passport side that can explain why is this difficult to do? I mean, the unbanked is really important. The equity issues are really huge. If I've just got off the phone with an hour conversation with a homeless shelter and community settlement director who's just, just frantic with the difficulties of life. But that also might mean that you could actually provide subsidies to folks. So I got like 6 questions about the question. It's a great question, but Gabe, let's start with you, then maybe to one of the passport folks or maybe one of the other panelists. Let's say the future is better recognition of equity, right? It was there as a problem, and now it's magnified times 100, and it's in our face. We have to deal with it. It's the right thing to do. So parking is just a piece of it. Mobility is a piece of it, but why can't we pay attention to providing resources to the unbanked, whether they're subsidized like a food stamp EBT card or whether they're a stored value card? I'll start with Gabe, and anybody else can raise their hand or speak up.
Sure. Well, I'll just say, Stephen, that, I think that there are some misconceptions about how to make things more equitable. For instance, there's an assumption that people don't have smartphones. And, as of 4 or 5 years ago here in DC, where I sit, and we have a pretty large low-income population, I think it was 94% of the population had a smartphone. I was talking actually to Mayor Reed and Mayor Bowser on a panel at South by Southwest, and I brought this up, and Mayor Reed said to me, yeah, but Gabe, the problem is that we have a lot of people that don't know how to use those phones. So we have a digital literacy problem compounded by an unbanked problem. However, there are entire applications out there, Cash App, Venmo. You brought up a more analog, idea with cards. You can sell parking cards at CVS. So I think there's a bit of laziness on government's part, to be honest, and on the private sector's part in partnering to figure out how to solve these problems that are not insurmountable. And I think post-COVID, the need for public-private coordination and partnership is going to be so important. And I think the private sector is going to be screaming for it. That, back to the previous topic, I think the data sharing, the ability, for instance, to, subsidize an Uber or Lyft trip instead of having a valet stand, or to share in revenue with the scooter companies, or at least let them pay for the time that the scooter's actually on the ground. Those things are going to have to come because, these companies aren't going to have the money to just pay ridiculous fees that outstrip their ability to generate revenue, obviously.
Any other responses? Hey, Marka, would you, as they think about the responses, that last question, which is the typeface is so small I can barely read it, but it looks like it's really important. Could you read that question to the panelists, please?
Sure. So the next question that came in, and I just want to make a comment, Stephen, quickly, just about the equity piece. I think, the equity piece is important, but we also need to think about, how many people really do have digital assets in their hands. When we think about cities going from analog to digital, yet everybody who's walking around those cities, we have smartphones. And so, I think there's an opportunity there. We need to think about that, but I think we need to give credit to the citizens and the people that are actually in those cities. So just a quick comment on that. So the question that came in, and it's a comment, it says, regarding automated parking enforcement, there is more enforcement and traffic control than the existing staff can handle. So confidence that it would not take jobs, but the same number or fewer to cover that enforcement needs and provide better traffic control and support. Further, you're all nodding your heads. Further, automated reduces some of the conflict officers encounter in the field. So here's the question. SF has needed to implement temperature loading to support social distancing for queuing or more takeout, and it's expected some of that will become permanent. Loading zones don't generate revenue such as meters, but are essential to support businesses, transit, safety. So here's the punchline, wondering how people are thinking about transforming more curb to loading.
Yeah.
It sounds like Gabe, you got a comment, and then John.
Yeah, well, first of all, loading zones should generate revenue. We converted ours while I was here in DC. You have to work with FedEx and UPS and others, whether it's, app-based, preferably, pay in advance, but you should be charging, I think, for loading. Yes, most cities are converting more space to loading, but it should be paid. I can't remember what my other point was. Oh, back to the.
How about your per minute? I mean, if you're gonna.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's how you charge. You can charge per minute, generate more revenue, give them a better deal. Don't enforce as much because you won't need to enforce, and you can do it automatically. If you have a app-based system, it's very easy for them to just hit a button and start, hit a button and stop. And I'll tell you that tickets are not tax deductible for these companies. It's just a huge cost. Parking is tax deductible. They do not mind paying for parking for loading.
John, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, we had started to move our loading zones, to add loading zones, but also make them commercial loading zones for the first half of the day, and then passenger loading and unloading for the evening hours near restaurants. And it was really successful. I think this whole COVID situation, I think, is going to allow us to reevaluate a lot of the curb space. I think it's an advantage we're going to have in coming from what it looks like to be a slow ramp up of activities. I think we're going to have the time to be able to say, hey, here's an area where we're going to want to add a loading zone, because, and you're absolutely right, Gabe. I think it's an opportunity for us that we don't charge for those loading zones right now, but it's something we absolutely need to do. It's another set of curb demand we need to manage. And if we're not managing it before this, it was absolutely a nightmare. I can't even begin to tell you how much we charged in citations to all the different companies. And I think it's just a good opportunity to modernize a practice there.
I guess, Stephen, just to go back to your question about the unbanked, I mean, I think it's an interesting point, because my observation is that we had sort of been hoping that other actors maybe would solve this problem, whether that was the credit card industry would come up with some instrument that worked well. I think more recently in the Boston area, we've been maybe pinning our hopes on the transit agency to, they were moving towards a sort of cashless system, and we thought maybe there would be an opportunity to partner with them on parking payment as part of that. But as you probably have seen, that project is not going anywhere that quickly. And probably will, it's a very expensive project, so it could also be a victim of, budget cuts, or at least slowed down by budget cuts in the future. So I think, maybe it is something where we have to work with the payment vendors that we use and see if we can come up with a system that can, rather than trying to follow and figure out what can we do that's based on what other people are doing, maybe we need to push to, figure out a solution that works for parking, and then maybe others can use that for other purposes, because it is a demand that is felt, all through our community. And so, if we have a system that works, people will adopt it perhaps even more widely than they would adopt a transit solution, because I don't know this as a statistic, but I'm going to venture that more people park, as a percentage of the population than take transit as a percentage of the population, other than maybe New York City, but even there. So I think it's a, like I said, maybe we just need to sort of grab the bull by the horns in this case.
Let me ask Michael and Mark, was Joseph, did you start to say something?
Well, I was going to just follow up. I think just a couple points really quickly. First one on the equity piece, and I think that again, what we have to do is just look at the numbers, look at the data, and being able to educate not only our council members and the public, but being able to show that there's actually a huge drop in usage for, actual physical coin and cash. As well as, I think that, the pay station being a digital, technologies itself, we're assuming that people have to know how to use that as well, which is similar to a cell phone in a sense. So, what we've been doing is kind of just reducing down the need for the total number of pay station or meters and locations, and really forcing the use of the app, and then providing more education. I think education is key, and being transparent about how these things work and what the benefit of them, and marketing that as a brand to be able to give out to people. And for commercial loading, I agree with John. We've started to do the same thing, looking at the curve a little bit differently as far as, when zones and dynamic curve space for different types of zones change, they should be the same use type. So if it's a commercial zone during the day, those should be transformed to valet services at night. They should never be a parking space for warehousing a vehicle. These are service type spaces, and so they should always switch for that. And we've done that with basically reducing the amount of commercial zones and passenger zones in town by just combining those together and actually adding more capacity for paid parking on the street.
Yeah, and Stephen, I don't know what you were going to ask me, but I'm going to jump in for a sec. Just this.
It's very impressive if you can answer the question before I ask it.
Well, let me answer a question, and then you can ask another. So just back to this equity conversation. If you think about restaurants and everything is all their they've got to ring through a point of sale system, right? So if you think about all the point of sale systems and John, you were talking about, trying to make sure that you maintain that equity and that parity with all your restaurants on the street and how people park and that sort of thing. There's a way to leverage that as a way to pay for parking, right? So you don't have to pay with the meter. You don't necessarily have to have a smartphone, but hey, I can go into my local grocery store and I can pay for parking and my car can be there for the next hour. So, I think that's something for us to think about. And of course, how do we push that concept forward? But those POS systems are in some way, shape or form, every single restaurant, every single storefront along the street.
Yeah. Let me ask you a follow-up, and then Michael, I want to come over and talk to you since you're probably the most data literate of many of us, how you would think about pricing of the commercial loading zones. But and Marka, let me see if I can ask this question correctly. So if a platform supports multiple payment opportunities, right? Not just a passport opportunity, but a multi-tenancy, right? So that whether you have a EBT card or a Mercedes with a built-in payment function, right? So shouldn't the future of multi-tenancy pay attention to equity as well, right? Because you've been thinking about multi-tenancy in terms of my Apple or Google Pay app, but you could also think about it in other ways so that the equity issue might be easier as the multi-tenancy goes up. Does that question make sense?
So I think, Stephen, what you're asking is multi-tenancy real and an opportunity for, cities in the future. I don't know if it's exactly what you're asking.
Well, that is it, but also with an explicit eye towards equity, right? Those communities that how folks unbanked or relatively poor would respond.
Yeah.
I'm just going to chime in. This is Gabe. I think absolutely. I think people should pay the way they want to pay. They should use the applications that they like to use. And we've been trying to shoehorn people into using, this, that, or the other thing. If you have one back end that controls, rate structures and all of that, but you let people choose whatever front end they want, I think that is much more equitable. Again, looking at the apps that people use for payment, they're very different populations using different apps, and we don't know why, but they just are. I remember when dockless bikes were launched, we saw a very different population using dockless bikes versus traditional dock bike systems. So being more agnostic on that makes a lot of sense to me, Stephen.
Yeah. So I think you're spot on there, Gabe. If I'm somebody that loves Starbucks coffee, I'd like to be able to have my Starbucks coffee app and go into Starbucks and maybe pay for my parking. Versus if I'm somebody that is constantly using, Google Maps, then maybe I can find my parking spot and pay for it that way. So you should make it easy for the customer And that goes back to the notion of, who Passport is and what we do and this whole operating system concept. It's, around you all as city leaders, again, you want to make your cities more equitable and livable for whomever comes in there. So if you can do that through some sort of operating system and double down on this multi-tenancy concept, I think it'll be a win for everyone.
Mark, in a second, I'd like you to read the last question.
Oh,
Let me tell a story while you do it. Michael, a few years ago, I was advising a large university, actually several of them, on parking policy, right? And more temperamental than the average resident is the average faculty member, right? So Joseph can mention this. And they view parking as like, a perk of life. So the school wanted to use dynamic pricing, but didn't want to upset the faculty. So the compromise was you can park for the same price, but you have to pay more to park closer to the door, right? So let's have a flat, easy price, but as the advantages go up, let's premium price it. Now I want Marco to read you the last question, and then you can talk about that in commercial loading zones if you would.
Okay, so we will likely see a slowdown to the quote unquote new normal for economic activity. SF has had a very robust and complex demand responsive parking meter pricing program with high max rates in busy areas up to $8 an hour. Currently, we have reduced pricing to 50 cents an hour citywide to accommodate the shelter in place order. Our city will need to backfill funds that subsidize curb management operations and public transit service. Question: as we look towards a post-shelter-in-place economy, what are your thoughts about how to reset meter rates that balance the needs for economic vitality and providing pricing that promotes parking turnover and availability?
I have a thought.
Great question, and thank you for that. Who's up first?
I have a quick thought, Marcus. So, you know what? I proposed this earlier about going to by the minute pricing to encourage turnover. I've been thinking for a while that over the long term, and I realize this is at odds with what I was saying 45 minutes ago, but enforcement may actually go away. And that the solution might be to charge a graduated scale over the course of an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. So basically, instead of having a huge ticket, you're going to pay 50 cents for the first half hour. You're going to pay $2 for the second half hour. When you get into the second hour, it might be $16, right? There are ways to adjust pricing and give people more carrots versus whacking them over the head with sticks. And I do think that we're going to have to be much more creative and maybe even look at other industries as we look at how we price parking to be more creative. And so we're not sort of detrimental to business, but we're actually enhancing the opportunity, creating win-win-wins, business, government, and citizens.
Yeah, and we had actually been about to start a pilot of a location where enforcement is extremely difficult to do because it's sort of out in a corner of the city, but it's also right near a transit station. So we were concerned about people parking all day if we just provided a regular rate. And so we're going to have it go up to like something like, I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it was going to be like $30 if you stayed all day long. And we'd actually set it up so that it was pay by plate. And if you left and came back or tried to feed the meter hour by hour, it would still continue to increment the payments over time so that you couldn't sort of play games with it, which is particularly with the pay by phone system is concerning because, right, you don't have to go back to the car to repay. You can just keep paying it remotely. So we haven't done that yet, but it's definitely, something we were trying. And the end point was like, yes, maybe there are, maybe not everywhere, but maybe there are locations where we can avoid the need for enforcement altogether and just provide the right price signal.
And Michael, you're the data guru. We'd like an extra 20% net revenues in every one of the cities listening.
Yeah, so I think first, something Gabe touched on, which I think is really important, is that end-to-end agnostic payment system. I think that doesn't really exist now, but if we could create that in hopefully some sort of open way, then Google can integrate with it, the revenues go to the city, people take a cut along the way, it integrates with multiple apps. I think that's really key, and that gets people out, using one system, any system they want for bikes, buses, cars, whatever, parking. For the curbside, let's say dynamic pricing, you know, with something like scooters, we know where all the scooters are. I think a big hurdle here is we don't know where all the cars are. We don't know how to have the right sensors to dynamically adjust pricing. Now we can look historically, we can look at data of our parking meter usage over weeks and months and try to come up with a plan for the current day. But what would be nice is if we could have a real-time demand where, I don't know, you know, your app would tell you when you're pulling into a space that this is right now at this moment it's going to cost this much money because there's an event nearby, and you don't even maybe necessarily care that there's an event nearby. You just know there's a lot of cars nearby, so people would be willing to pay a lot more. But we don't really have those sensors yet. I think that's sort of a gap. But if we can get that, or maybe the people become the sensors, the apps, I think there's a way to do that dynamically in real time. And I'll point out too that I think these solutions are going to have to be city by city. So if you compare two cities, LA, Los Angeles versus LA, Louisville area, we have some very different laws and regulations. You know, anecdotally in LA, I've heard stories that, you know, like you think about UPS drivers, they might have $10 million in fines for a year for double parking. And if you talk to them and say, you know, if can you pay us $5 million a year for dedicated curbside, they'd immediately say yes. And that's a great solution. But in Louisville, we have, for instance, an ordinance that says any delivery vehicle is allowed to double park, no fines at all. And that came about in the 70s, I think, because our UPS Worldport is located here. And so I think part of that deal is any vehicle can double park anywhere at any time. So there's no incentive. We never give out parking tickets for that. So it's a little harder to do something like that and have paid curb for deliveries in Louisville versus some other cities.
Yeah, well, that's a very weird policy you've got there.
So many bad things happened in the 70s.
So let me make a minute comment and turn it back to Marka to close. So, so the proposition of this session together, right, is that everything is changing, a lot's changing for the worse, but that's also an opportunity for enlightened public officials to make substantial contributions. There's a lot of ways that parking has, and mobility, mostly parking has developed over the years. The technologies now outpace those original policies. The ability to make a difference actually is much better. But it's not just about revenue, right? We have ability, just think about that conversation we had about multi-tenancy. We have an opportunity to dramatically drive customer service, right? To make people, give people more choices. We have an opportunity, as John and Joseph mentioned, to think more about how the services to retail by turnover, service to retail by letting them pay. So I'm hoping that at least for the 60 folks that are on about 60 folks are on the conversation, there's some set of good ideas that recognize that we have a mobility platform we can use. We have a lot of information we can use. Since the world is changing, let's see if we can help it change for the better. Back to you, Marka, and thanks everybody for their time.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Gabe. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Joe, Joseph, and John for joining us this afternoon. If you want to continue engaging with Passport, and we hope that you do, we do have a forum called the Mobility Leaders Forum on LinkedIn. We invite you to join. Stephen is the host of that forum, and we have lots of provocative questions we ask on a regular basis. But this is a really important topic, and the way we talked about kind of post-shelter in place and what it's going to look like for all of you as city leaders. Passport is here to help, and we're looking forward to doing that in the months to come. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day, and hopefully we'll find you out on the web, and this recording will be made available for your future use and listening pleasure. Thanks so much. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.